Thank you for this invitation to talk with you. What I want to do is to talk about what responsible tourism is, about what's happening in India, and also about how we might reset tourism for the future. And finally, I'll leave some resources. This is being recorded, so you should be able to get the slides online after my presentation. So first of all, let's talk about the challenge of sustainable development. I'm old enough now to remember the shock when we all saw this photograph, the Earthrise taken by Apollo 8 in 1968. I was just 16 back in 1968, and it's dominated my experience of the world ever since. We live in a finite world, and that photograph made that very clear. Many of the problems that now confront us listed on this slide come from the fact that we are now living in a finite world in which we are bumping up against the limits to our expansion. We're facing non-linear change, which means that we get crises. And you can see this. In 1972, I was at the University of York studying politics. That was the year that the UN first addressed the challenge of sustainable development. It was a good university, but I heard nothing about the World Commission on Environment and Development in 1972. By 1992, we were at Rio, and I did hear about the Rio conference. 20 years on, at Rio Plus 20, we're now 40 years since I was at university, a whole lifetime. And we've made in my lifetime, that 40 years of a working life, we've made very, very little progress, and we're still going far too slowly to achieve sustainability. So 40 years on, we get the publication of the Limits to Growth, which in 1972 made the front page of a newspaper, but wasn't taught in universities at all. 40 years on, we're still not making progress. There have been 4 world summits, the most recent in 2002, and then 2012. It's not clear that there will be a summit in 2022. The over-tourism that we've seen is a problem which is a result of not doing anything more than paying lip service to sustainability. And we have only paid lip service to sustainability for the last 40 years. We've simply not done enough, quickly enough, to address the problems. We know what the problems are, but we've been very slow to deal with them. Back in 1972, when I saw the reports of the Club of Rome and the crisis that was going to come, I did not believe that it was possible that it would happen. In 2014 and 2016, research was done to look at those original forecasts, to look at whether, in fact, those forecasts were realistic, and they were. What I believed in 1972 would never happen is happening, and it's happening now. The younger generation, future generations, are going to have to move much more quickly, and the next 10 years are probably critical to whether we make life on this earth more unpleasant for ourselves, or whether we turn it round and make life more sustainable. We see the problems of climate change. These are the figures which we have since 1958 from Hawaii. And you can see this constant rise in the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and with that, global warming. You can see the shrinking of the ice in the Arctic and the similar process in Antarctica. We create these carbon emissions, which are now creating such a problem for us. It's our activity on Earth which adds to this. And I live in a coastal zone where in 30 years' time, the scientists predict that there will be seawater lapping at my front door if we don't do anything to reduce the speed of climate change. If we continue with business as usual, we'll have many more disasters of this kind. We'll have flooding and drought, both of which are disasters for our food supplies and for the people who live in those affected areas. This is the most recent figures that I could find going through into 2020. And you can see where the warmest years have been since 1880, when records began. Dramatic increase in the average global temperature at the surface since 1880. Plastic waste is another big problem. All over the world now we have these gyros of plastic in the oceans, which means that it's getting into our food chain and we're eating these plastics when we eat fish, and we're finding it now in our drinking water as well. The level of plastic pollution is such that we're now actually in the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is a geological reference to the fact that the geology of our planet now is dominated by us as a species because we've caused so much pollution. The most obvious example of that is the plastics, which will still be around. If there are archaeologists in 1,000 years' time, they'll be finding our plastic, and we will be the age of plastic in the Anthropocene. So what I'd like to suggest is that the fig leaf has fallen off, the fig leaf of sustainability, which has so often been mouthed, so often talked about, but so little has been done. And we've really been bumping up against the limits to growth. And that's resulted in social and economic conflict on an increasing scale, with migration, with drought and famine and war growing around the world almost year by year. In tourism terms, the advert on the left of the screen talking about moving on whenever a place gets spoiled. This is a genuine advertisement from a good company. Kolkata Holidays is a good tour operator, but they're making a point which is true for all of us. Once a place is spoiled, we move on. We cease to go there. So it doesn't make sense to allow the destinations to be spoiled by over-tourism. So what's the problem with sustainability? The real problem is that it's vague. It's really hard to define it in any way that you can measure whether or not we are becoming more sustainable. The aspiration is a noble one, and I certainly support it. But you can see in the very language that there's too much value judgment involved. Optimal use, that's a value judgment. Respect and authenticity, these are not precise scientific categories. Providing social economic benefits to all stakeholders that are fairly distributed. Again, it's a value judgment, it's not an objective statement. As UNWTO has pointed out, to achieve sustainability, you certainly need strong political leadership. And the two places in the world which have probably made the most progress, and I'd argue that they are Barcelona and Kerala in India, those two places both have very strong democratic systems with good political leadership. But the fundamental problem is that sustainability lacks a technical definition. So I'd like to make very clear today that I don't see sustainable tourism and responsible tourism as the same thing. They're very different. Responsible tourism is about what we do to try to make tourism more sustainable. It's about taking responsibility for achieving sustainable development through tourism. It's about what we do. Sustainability is the aspiration. The taking of responsibility, what we do, that is responsible tourism. And there's a lot more talk about sustainability than there is action around the idea of responsibility. So it's about what businesses and individuals do beyond the minimum legal requirements. You have to go beyond what is required by the law to be able to demonstrate that you are taking responsibility. Of course, if you break the law, if you don't apply even the minimum legal requirements in whatever field it is, whether it's over carbon emissions, labour standards, pollution, plastic disposal, if you're breaching any of those, then you're clearly being irresponsible. I take much of my inspiration from Maurice Strong, who's the Canadian who pressed for and subsequently chaired Secretary General of that first summit in 1972, where he said, we may get to the point where the only way of saving the world will be for industrial civilization to collapse. Now, when I was tour leading, I travelled up the seaboard of Peru, and there you see one civilization after another, all of which doubtless believed that they would exist forever, all of which subsequently collapsed. One civilization after another, which has collapsed generally because they exceeded the carrying capacity of the environment around them to sustain the civilization that they had built. And we're in a similar situation now in our civilization, that we're taking too many resources out of the environment and not paying enough attention to our sustainability. I want to make the point that tourism is not a natural phenomenon. Tourism is what we, both the producers in the tourism businesses and the transport providers, and the consumers, you and me as tourists, it's what we make it. It's not a natural phenomenon. We can change it. There are hosts and guests, there are visitors and tourists. It's a social construct. We can make tourism better. You often hear tourism businesses wanting more access. They want people to be able to get there faster. They need to remember that when people get there faster, they can also leave faster. So that now a trip to Everest Base Camp, which normally used to take 3 weeks, can be done in 10 days. That means that you're getting 11 bed nights less in Nepal for people to visit Everest Base Camp than you were when it took you longer to get there. Giving people more rapid access means they can also leave more quickly, and it reduces the bed nights. When I was tour operating, it was quite not unusual to sell a 3-week tour. Now it's very unusual for anyone to be able to sell a 3-week trip. People expect to get there and back much faster. There's also a problem about the way we measure tourism. Generally, governments use international arrivals. Sometimes they use length of stay, but they almost never look at spend, and even more rarely do they look at the retained yield. What is actually left in the local and the national economy when the tourist has left? Very rarely is that attended to. It's not the way people measure the success of a tourism minister. It's always done by the number of arrivals and international arrivals at that. So the key question politically, if you're a destination manager, is does a destination use tourism, or is it used by tourism? That's the fundamental question that lies at the back of responsible tourism. Are we going to use tourism to make better places for people to live in, or are we going to allow tourism to use us and our places? So tourism is a social construct, and this idea goes back to Josh Krippendorf, who is really the father of responsible tourism. He made the point that tourism is what we make it, and that therefore we can change it, and that every individual tourist builds up or destroys human values while they travel. We do that by the way we choose to travel. What we need, he said, are rebellious tourists and rebellious locals. He makes the point, and I think this is completely right, that orders and prohibitions on their own won't do the job. What we need is the positive experience of taking responsibility, of feeling that we've contributed to making the world a better place. The problem with sustainable development is that it means different things to different people. It's too abstract, it's too general, we still can't really define it. People engage with particular issues. So you see campaigns about plastics or carbon emissions or air flight, or we'll look at this in a minute, child protection. What's important about responsible tourism is that we do focus on the issues that matter to people, and most issues are local. There are only 2 issues which affect our global environment, and that's carbon emissions, because that changes our global climate, and plastics, because that gets into the ocean and floats around the world. But nearly every other issue is a local issue. The issue may arrive in many different places, maybe an issue in many different places, but it's still a local issue. So, for example, issues of drought and water supply, particularly of clean drinking potable water, are major issues, but they don't, and they appear all over the world, but there's no global solution to it. The solutions all have to be found and implemented locally by businesses, local government, communities, working together to find sustainable sources of potable water locally. So to achieve sustainability by taking responsibility, we can't ignore local cultures and the local context. They are critical. We need to make change, and to do that, we have to engage in the political process. It won't be engaged by writing things and putting them on Facebook. We have to engage with people in power and those without to make sure that we get changes that use tourism to make the world a better place. We've made too little progress. We need to do a lot more. So why the emphasis on responsibility? I like the concept for two reasons, really. The first is that it's about acting, it's about responding, it's about what you do. It implies and requires action. And critical to creating change is acknowledging and owning up to the problem, taking responsibility. So that's the first reason. The second is that it enables you to attribute blame. You can point out who is being irresponsible, who is creating the problem, and what needs to be done to change it. The other thing I'd say to you is that responsibility is free. You don't have to go and buy it in the supermarket. You can take it. You can take as much of it as you can handle. It comes at a cost because you have to handle it, but it is free. You don't need to buy it. So why responsible? As I've said, it's about accountability and it's about responding. Individuals and organizations that claim to be responsible have to demonstrate how they're making a difference. Generally, that requires partnerships with other people. It's quite difficult to change things to a significant degree without engaging with others. I like very much the quote from Abraham Lincoln. You cannot escape the responsibility of tomorrow by evading it today. And the reality is that the climate change, which is going to come unless we change it, will be our responsibility. It's already my generation's responsibility. It will become the next generation's responsibility if you don't sort it out, if you don't address it. One of the problems we have as human beings is the ostrich problem. We keep thinking to ourselves, someone else will sort it out. Well, I regret to say that the track record from the last 40 years demonstrates that they haven't sorted it out. The problems are still getting worse faster than we're addressing them. So, what are the core values of responsible tourism? It's about taking responsibility. It's about what you do. It's about transparency. It's about reporting and being very clear, not just about what you've done, but about why you've done it and what the outcome and the impacts are that you've had. What have you changed? You need to be able to report that. So in a destination with water shortages, how would I select a hotel with the lowest consumption per bed night? The truth is, at the moment, I can't, because there's no mechanism for me being reliably informed of which hotel in a drought-hit area has the best performance on water. The certification processes that we have are opaque. Can't understand them. I can't see behind them. They're unenforceable. I don't know if they're being complied with, and they communicate very little to me about what's going on. So very difficult at the moment to see the transparency. That's why the awards, which I'll talk about in a little, is so important. So what is responsible tourism? First of all, it's about identifying the issues which matter and addressing them. Secondly, it's a triple bottom line. The triple bottom line we all know: economic, social, and environmental. For the traveller, for the tourist, it's a way of travelling. I would argue that it offers a better experience because you get local You get a better local experience if you travel with a responsible tourism operator or travel in a way designed to experience the authenticity of the destination. It's become a movement. There are a lot of people now engaged in this, but it's still diverse. It's particular to cultures, places, and organisation. What constitutes responsible tourism in Kerala or in Delhi is different from what constitutes responsible tourism in Cape Town or the Gambia. There are similarities, but there are still differences. One of the critical things is transparency, so that you can actually see what is being done to make tourism more responsible. The transparency is critical. To be part of the responsible tourism movement, you have to accept that you have responsibility and you have to be willing to take action. It's an easy movement to join, but you need to be able to demonstrate that you've joined by what you do. This is the original slide from the Cape Town conference in 2002, which was really the founding conference for responsibility. And you can see there that it fits within the UNWTO's Global Code of Ethics. There's a principle of sustainability, which is the triple bottom line, and it talks about taking and exercising responsibility. The challenge is across the bottom, because you begin to see how many groups need to engage in order to make tourism responsible. Tour operators, inbound operators, hoteliers and accommodation providers, local and national governments in the destination, attraction managers, national parks, heritage, local communities, and of course the tourists, the travellers, the holidaymakers. They all need to do their bit if we're to make tourism more responsible. Very important to understand that you can't outsource your responsibility. It is your responsibility to take the action. And that means it's everyone's responsibility. But the problem, if it's everybody's, is that very often it ends up being nobody's. And nobody's is the problem that we've had over the last 40 years, where people have talked about sustainability, but really very few people, almost nobody, has done anything to achieve it. This is the definition of responsible tourism that came out of the Cape Town Declaration. Some of this will be familiar, some of it perhaps not. The first, for example, about minimizing negative impacts is common to all definitions of sustainability. We place in responsible tourism, though, far more emphasis on greater economic benefits for local people, enhancing the well-being of host communities, improving working conditions, and giving small enterprises, SMMEs, sole traders, craft workers, far more access to the industry than is commonly the place. The third part of the definition is very different from sustainability, talking about involving local people in the decisions that affect their lives and their life chances, enabling them through the democratic processes to have influence over the shape of tourism in their community and the terms on which they get access to the industry. Kerala has been really good at achieving this. It's also about making a positive contribution to the conservation of natural and cultural heritage and to maintaining the world's diversity. That, after all, is what drives tourism. It's the fact that Kerala is very different from Faversham in Kent, where I live, that makes me want to go there and experience a different way of living. Fifth, and you don't see this often in sustainability, really important to create enjoyable experience for tourists and to give them the meaningful connections with local people and the better understanding of local culture and environment, which people long for. We can do that through responsible tourism. It's about providing access for those people with medical and physical challenges and the social disadvantage. And critically important, it's about being culturally sensitive and running tourism on the basis of respect between the tourists and the hosts. So it's a big agenda and nobody can deal with all of it at once. But the important thing is to start to do something about these issues. The agenda is not, though, limited just to the triple bottom line of economic, social, and environmental. This, for me, is a critical issue. Children are not tourist attractions, and they should not be treated as such. Very important that people don't visit orphanages. Been too many examples of children being trafficked into orphanages because it's a lucrative way of taking money from tourists. People turn a blind eye very often to trafficking. Very important, if you see it, to report it. So, to sum up this part of my talk, sustainable and responsible tourism are not the same thing. They should not be used interchangeably. Sustainable is an abstract long-term objective. It's a goal. Responsible tourism is about what we do to achieve sustainable development through tourism for local communities. It's the difference. The difference is between an abstract aim and what you do to achieve it. It's what we do that matters, not what we say, but what we do. So ultimately, we're about using tourism to make better places for people to live in. In the Cape Town Declaration, it's defined as using tourism to make better places to live in and better places to visit. You can always tell if somebody hasn't quite understood the point, because they'll talk about using tourism to make better places to visit and better places to live in. It's very important that we put local people first when we talk about responsible tourism. So the aspiration is to use tourism rather than to be used by it. There's a phrase, a proverb in a way, that you hear often in other parts of, particularly of Southeast Asia. People will talk about tourism being like a fire, and they make the point that you can use it to cook your food, or it can burn your house down. We have to control tourism if we're to get the benefits of it and to reduce the negative impacts. There are places in the world now where it has more or less burnt the house down, and the consequence of that is that people move on and no longer visit. So the core values of responsible business, as I've said, are about transparency, reporting. And we have to remember what Molière said. It is not only for what we do that we're held responsible, but also for what we do not do. And that's the point about irresponsible tourism. So I've said already that this originates in the work of Jost Krippendorf, and he, more than anybody else, is responsible for this. It's about absorbing and using tourism as a lever to make positive change in the world. It's about getting beyond the aspiration and getting to a situation where we can achieve that aspiration. The antonym, of course, is irresponsible, and I was asked to say something briefly about this. Irresponsible tourism has two meanings, really. There's a sense of it being unreliable, untrustworthy, and unlikely to be held to account. It's also something we say when somebody's mentally or financially unfit to do what they're doing. It's a very heavy word to use. Nobody really wants to be accused of irresponsibility. But it's also about lacking a sense of irresponsibility. It's a sense of carefreeness, the sense of being able to do it without worry or responsibility. And that argument is sometimes put to me. It's happened a lot, actually, around the debates over swimming with dolphins. People will tell me that lots of tourists want to swim with dolphins and it's fine. What I say to the tour operators, who largely now, I must say, have stopped selling tickets for swimming with dolphins, but what I say to the tour operators is, don't forget that when people realize what they've done and they understand the negative impact that they've had on the dolphins by swimming with them, they'll remember that you sold them the ticket. They're not going to forget that. You're damaging your brand in the future. You're damaging your reputation, because people will understand that they're doing something that they shouldn't have done, and that you facilitated and possibly encouraged that. You can't escape that responsibility. So it's important to think about the long-term value of your brand or of your destination when you think about what's acceptable. In the Indian context, of course, riding on elephants, there's been a big campaign against that recently, and many people have now stopped offering elephant rides as part of the tourist experience, and that's been well received by the tourists in the originating markets. So sustainability is difficult to define, it's complex, there's lots of competing and conflicting objectives in play. And Aristotle, all those centuries ago, pointed out that what we need to do is to avoid the unintended consequences of our actions. We need to think hard about what we're doing and about what the unintended consequences might be. There's a strong business case, or rather cases, for responsible tourism. There's no one case. The first thing to say is that it's the right thing to do. Morally, the right thing to do. And of course, all those directors of company boards on businesses, they're people too. They have children and grandchildren. And very often I hear from directors of companies that it's their children or their grandchildren who pointed out the problems of waste disposal or carbon emissions and motivated them to do something about it. There's a series of business reasons. It minimizes risk, provides a license to operate. It gives you a better quality product if you're selling fresh food sourced locally. It saves you costs very often if you sell things which are purchased locally. It improves staff morale and it makes people want to stay because they're enjoying their job and feeling they're making a difference. It gives you market advantage in a whole series of different ways. You're providing a better experience, which is guilt-free and more authentic. And of course, you've got the product differentiation and the PR advantage. And we know that people are far less likely to refer or encourage people to book with you if they have any doubts about your credentials. It also encourages repeat visits and repeat bookings. The business case for being responsible is very strong. So it's about using tourism to make a better place to live in. And I wanted now to talk about India. And I want to go through this fairly quickly because you can look at this on the site. But since 2004, we've been running the World Responsible Tourism Awards, and many Indian businesses have won. And you can find them listed here under the India Responsible Tourism Award since 2016. But the World Responsible Tourism Awards here, if you click on that link on the Responsible Tourism Partnership website, and the link for that is coming later in the presentation, you'll be able to access the both the India Awards and the World Awards from 2004. And there are many Indian businesses and individuals who've won. Just occasionally, the judges give a judges award. Now, the only people who can win judges awards are people who represent companies or organizations which have won multiple times and been awarded by different panels of judges. And there are only 5 people ever been given a judges award for responsible tourism. 3 of them are in Southern Africa. The other 2 are in India. Joe's Dominic of Clean, Green, Healthy Earth Hotels and Rupesh Kumar of the Kerala Responsible Tourism Mission. Talk first of all about Kerala. The Responsible Tourism Mission emerged from the 2008 conference on responsible tourism in destinations, which was really when responsible tourism came to India pretty much for the first time. And you can see there the strapline of the Responsible Tourism Mission, making better places for people to visit and better places for people to live in. You can find the links to the Responsible Tourism Mission there, and the Responsible Tourism Partnership, my organisation, has published 2 documents on responsible tourism in Kerala. The tourism impacts in Kumarakoram was the result of a census of the activity that was requested by the Minister of Tourism in Kerala, and a piece of work we did on the local impacts of Coconut Lagoon in Kumarakoram as well. The work that the Responsible Tourism Mission is doing in Kerala is undoubtedly a leading example, arguably the leading example of responsible tourism. It's an extremely important area of experimentation. And the experiments which were started soon after the 2008 conference have now been proven. Much has been learned, and it's been rushed out across now the whole state. So the responsible tourism mission is now running across the whole of Kerala. And I'm pleased to say that Madhya Pradesh is also forming linkages with Kerala to learn about how to do responsible tourism about Madhya Pradesh. So major changes are underway. CGH Earth is a series of destination resorts across southern India primarily. And you can see from this screenshot of their website that they look at the whole broad agenda, the whole horizon of responsible tourism, from people to heritage, the environment, to community, to local ethos and conservation. It's a stunning example of a responsible tourism business which is highly profitable with a good level of repeat business, in large part because of the significant number of people who repeat visit and its reputation. Coconut Lagoon happens to be my favorite, but there are lots of good examples of resort destinations firmly embedded in the local community in the CGH Earth resorts. A word that you don't often hear used in relation to tourism is neighbourliness, but I think it's an important word in understanding what responsible tourism is. It's about understanding that your hotel, your resort, your guide service, your tour operation, whatever it is, relies upon the neighborhood or the neighborhoods in which you operate. You're basically selling somebody else's place to people from outside of that place, to tourists. That's become very obvious during this year of crisis with the COVID-19 epidemic. So this year in the World Responsible Tourism Awards, we're not pre-announcing categories. We're not categorizing the potential winners. What we're looking to do is to commend those businesses, individuals and destinations which have gone the extra mile to address the challenges of COVID-19 in this exceptional year. And there's a whole way in which people might have done that. They may have looked after neighbours and employees, finding ways of sustaining business to keep local people employed, or using their facilities to help their neighbours cope with COVID-19. So in Africa, for example, one lodge has used the lodge to accommodate people who are vulnerable, particularly vulnerable to COVID-19, and allowed them to go into quarantine in that tourism resort. It might be that you've done something to decarbonise travel and tourism, which remains the real priority for the sector. And of course, we can't isolate ourselves from climate change. We can't self-isolate to avoid the consequence of climate change. It might be that you've done something to support wildlife and habitat in a year when wildlife and conservation have been very negatively impacted by the loss of tourism revenue. Might be that you've engaged in maintaining meaningful connections with potential visitors through your value-led marketing and your social media engagement. Maybe about fundraising for people, wildlife, or heritage. Or it might be about developing domestic tourism to replace the international tourism that's been lost. If you know of businesses which have been doing those things, please go to the website and nominate them. Very important that we have a good number of people who are nominated, and if we get a good number of nominations, we will be making separate awards for India, Africa, and for the world. So please, if you know of people who should be nominated, if you feel you should yourself be nominated, please nominate them on the website, and the links there to do that. Now, to turn to the final part of what I was asked to talk about, which is the impact of COVID-19. These are the latest figures from a recent article in Nature. And you can see the growth in daily CO2 emissions since 1917. You can see the dramatic drop-off that's occurred during COVID-19. The reality, however, is that very quickly, I think, this will return to business as usual. We'll very quickly be going back to that view of Delhi on the left with the smog. It's wonderful to see it as it is now on the right, but I think business as usual, which will return as people struggle to get their livelihoods back, because we have to recognize that the economic crisis is also serious as a consequence of COVID-19. It's not just a health crisis, it's an economic crisis, and people will need to get back to employment and to work, and that means that the smog levels will come back. In a few places, they may be a little lower, but I'm very pessimistic that a major change will occur. Is this going to be a step change or a return to business as usual? I fear that most places in the world, we will go back to business as usual. People's expectations and demand for economic growth will have been questioned. People will have had doubts, but I think they'll very quickly go back to where they were. And there will be a dash, in my view, there will be a dash to catch up. So what can we say about the potential recovery? I think the first thing to say is it will be slow, it'll be lumpy, and there will be more spikes, both in originating markets, in the source markets, and in the destinations. The recovery will depend, therefore, on what happens in the destination and what happens in the source markets. If you think about me deciding whether or not to travel to Kerala in 2021, there'll be two sets of issues, won't there? There'll be a question about whether I feel that I am not going to imperil Kerala by traveling from the UK to Kerala with the risk that I'll carry COVID with me. There's the risk that my government will ban air traffic again between the UK and India, make it impossible for me to travel even if I'd booked. And it's unlikely that I can get insurance, travel insurance, to cover the risk of not being able to travel, because insurance companies are now excluding COVID from their insurance cover. There's also the risk that if I get to Spain on my trip and Spain has a spike of COVID while I'm in Spain, that I will be locked out of the UK and locked down in Spain at my own cost. And again, that won't be an insurable risk, because the tour operator travel companies and the travel agents and the insurance companies will not be willing or able to cover that risk. So the future for international travel looks very difficult. And I suspect that there will be periodic lockdowns within destinations as well, within countries. There certainly have been in South Africa. So again, there may well be difficulties about traveling between home and your destination around the world and within larger countries too. Already we have a situation in the UK where, whilst I can go travel as far as I like in England, I can't currently travel in Scotland. A lot of talk about air bridges and bubbles. This may be part of the solution, but they will be difficult to negotiate and difficult to police. Let's hope that they can exist. The one between Australia and New Zealand looks as though it will be the first available in the world. I think it's true that trust will become the new currency of travel. We'll need to be able to believe that the place we're going to really will be squeaky clean, that I won't have a risk of catching COVID because of something that someone's left behind in the room when I check into it, that the airline will be able to enforce social distancing and that everyone will wear a mask. There will be lots of challenges around this. WTTC have produced excellent guidance on safe travel. Aviation will, I think, be slow to recover. It will begin, but it will be slow. Domestic tourism and the staycation will prosper. But again, if there are spikes, this will be more difficult. The future, however, will be what we make it. Tourism is a social phenomenon. we can make it better if we choose to do so. I would encourage all of us to take responsibility and to make tourism better, whether we're in the business or whether we're just consumers. We all have a responsibility. There are things that we can all do. I wanted to end with this slide, which gives you access to the resources. On my website, the link there, you'll find my publications. There's a lot available for free there. On the WTM Hub, you can find the links to the responsible tourism information available on the WTM website and the regular blogs. On the Responsible Tourism Partnership website, you can find all of those links I was suggesting to the Responsible Tourism Awards, to the ICRT India Network, and to the Indian Responsible Tourism Awards. And there's a Facebook group too for ICRT India. Thank you for listening. That's the end of my presentation. I hope there are some questions. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, sir, for your wonderful presentation. Now, there are a few questions. I just ask Professor Vandita Hagra to please coordinate the session.
Mr. Goodwin, in the meantime, since we will be taking the questions now from the participants, may I request you to stop sharing the screen, and if you can come and everybody can see you while you take the questions?
Well, thank you, sir. That was a informative and a very engaging session. You have provided us with a very refreshing perspective of what responsible tourism is and what is the scope of the same. So our first question is from our master student, Madhu Priya. She is asking, what can the destinations do to move away from acting as marketing organizations solely and focus on being responsible management companies, an environment as well as a social emphasis?
It is slowly beginning to happen now in some destinations. It's happening across Europe. The leading places for doing this at the moment are probably Barcelona and Amsterdam, and to a lesser degree San Francisco. But it is beginning to happen. What is fundamental to what's politically at the root of this, and it is in the end a political question about how a place gets used, but at the heart of the question is who controls the place. Now, in reality, of course, all destinations are managed by local government in one form or another, whether that's a village, panchayat in India, or a city administration. It's at that level that the city or the village or the community is managed for tourism. The problem is that too often destination management organizations, as they've called themselves, have really only been about marketing. I'm very skeptical that those organizations can ever manage a city or a village. Really, the right to manage the place resides with the locally elected councillors, and we need to recognize that. We are beginning to see in places like Barcelona and Amsterdam, the local authorities asserting that and asserting their control over what the marketing organizations do. So that in Barcelona, for example, the bulk of the money now goes to managing tourism in Barcelona rather than to marketing it. And that's the change that we need to see. And we also need people to understand that what matters is how much money the tourists spend and where they spend it, rather than just how many visitors you have. Good question.
Our next question is from another of our students. She is asking, how would one stop the remote and rural locations from getting too overwhelmed? Because it is expected that post-COVID-19 domestic tourism would be very much popular compared to that of international tourism.
I think that's right, that domestic tourism will bounce back much more quickly than the international. I think what needs to happen is a change in the culture of the people who are traveling, so that they go and stay in the destination and get to know that place better rather than constantly keep moving. So, for example, in Kerala, what you're seeing there now is the growth of so many places where you can go and have those village life experiences, that none of them become overcrowded. Kumarakoram used to be very overcrowded with tourists, but as more destinations have opened up in rural areas, that load is spread so that the hotspots don't occur to the same degree, and more people are experiencing the benefits in more villages across Kerala. That's the only way that it can be done. Encourage people to stay locally, and then you won't get the massive numbers of people coming through just on day trips. What's the next question?
Our next question is from Sushmita. She is our master student. Her question is, how can we ensure that acting ethically and responsibly in the context of tourism becomes the norm and not a short-lived craze or a fad?
Obviously it's a fear of mine that it will become a fad. I think the reality is that if we change the way we market tourism, it will change. If we change the way we behave, it will change. That Gandhi proverb that we often hear, that aphorism, be the change you want to see in the world, applies very strongly with responsible tourism. People who experience responsible tourism get hooked on it because it's a better experience. There'll always be a few who don't see that it's a better experience. The vast majority of people, once they've had a responsible tourism experience, want more of it. So if you ask Justin Francis of responsibletravel.com, he will say that very few people come to his website initially for the first time looking for responsible tourism. They come looking for a great trip. But once they've had that experience, they come back time and time again because that's the kind of experience that they're looking for. We also have the advantage that responsible tourism fits very well with the modern consumer trend for experiential tourism, which is becoming a very dominant form of consumerism, not just in tourism, but generally. If you look for experiential travel or the experience economy on Google, you'll find lots of evidence for the existence of this across consumption in general. It's not just a tourism phenomenon, and that's working very much in our favor in terms of developing responsible tourism. Next question
is from Kaustav Nag of Masters, MA Masters in 4th semester. His question is, the World Tourism Organization has designated Spanish football legend and World Cup winner Iker Casillas as special ambassador for responsible tourism. Do you think such icons can actually promote the cause?
I think it's extremely important that we use celebrity to promote the cause. I don't know about the particular individual that I'm being asked about, but I do think that celebrities like Michael Palin, for example, have had a very big impact in spreading the word about how to travel better, and we need to use celebrity. And footballers are clearly celebrities. It's a very useful way of communicating the importance of taking responsibility and of traveling in a responsible way.
There's one more question that is coming up. The question is geotourism a responsible tourism?
Well, I don't know. What I would like to say is that all forms of tourism can be more responsible. There's no particular form of tourism which is responsible. So ecotourism, for example, for a long time claimed to be better for the environment, better for wildlife, better for conservation. But actually, when we looked for evidence of that in research that we did, in part in India, but also in Indonesia and in Africa, we couldn't find the evidence for that. There's no evidence that an ecotourist puts more back into the environment, provides more for local communities than any other kind of tourism. The question is not the kind of tourism, it's the way the tourism is delivered. So any kind of tourism, mass tourism, ecotourism, geotourism, wellness tourism, all forms of tourism can be more responsible, but none of them are by definition responsible. Responsible tourism is not a category of travel and tourism. It's a way of traveling, it's a way of providing tourism, and it's a way of taking responsibility to minimize our negative impacts and maximize our positive ones. So geotourism can be responsible, or it can be irresponsible. Ecotourism can be responsible or it can be irresponsible. Rather sadly, ecotourism has more often been irresponsible than it has been responsible.
Thank you so much for your patience for answering questions. There's one last question I'll take on. The question is, how can circular economy add to responsible tourism?
The circular economy is one of the ways of ensuring that the environmental impact is less. And clearly, the circular economy is an important part of delivering responsibility and of responsible tourism. It's an important way in which we take responsibility. It has the additional advantage that where you upcycle waste into saleable products as a form of circular economy, you're actually improving local livelihoods as well. And I don't think in terms of the circular economy, we don't talk enough about the potential benefits in terms of local livelihoods that the circular economy can bring. It's too often seen just as an environmental issue, and it clearly is that, but it also has massive economic advantages for those communities involved in upcycling, recycling, and delivering the circular economy.
Thank you so much, sir, for sharing with us such valuable inputs and ideas and sparing your time. And it was really an engaging and learning session. And all of us have learned a lot, and we're looking for more sessions with you. Thank you very much, sir. And
thank you. Thank you very much. It's been very good to do this with you, and I hope we might do it again. Thank you.